FBC Edge, Edge Parents, First Baptist Chickamauga, anyone else who may end up seeing this video. I hope you guys are having a good week. This is Michael at the Edge Building, just getting ready for week 6 of our study through the book of Job, called Though He Slay Me, which is from a passage in the book of Job. And this has been an interesting week with all the stuff that has been going on already. But also with the storm and the damage that came through on Sunday. Man, what a wild time it is. I spent the last 2 days with some folks doing a little bit of cleanup, cutting down trees, and just helping begin to put back some of the pieces for some families. And I'll tell you, it has been, and if you've ever been a part of disaster relief, it's a incredibly difficult thing because you realize as you are doing some small task that it pales in comparison to what they are experiencing. And so we spent the day yesterday in Ottawa and showed a couple of pictures, but the family that we were helping, both the son and the father-in-law live next door. They both have trees that came through their house and did quite a bit of damage, stuff around the yard, obviously. But what stuck out to me the most was beside those two homes, there was a little single-wide mobile home, and a tree had actually gone straight through the middle of it. And I talked to the lady who lived there, and I mean, just knowing that in an instant, most everything that she had was gone and ruined, and you could just see the look of shock, and you could see the look of desperation on her face. As we drove down the road, one of the things that just stuck out to me so much was this idea that for every house that we saw, there was a family that was represented by that was trying to figure out how to pick up the pieces and how to move on. And until you've been in a situation like that, experiencing what they've experienced, it's really hard to understand what they're thinking or why they respond, both positive or negative, the way that they do. It's hard to understand that. Several years ago, we took a group of our students here from West Virginia, or from here to West Virginia, as part of another disaster relief effort in a little town called Clendenin, West Virginia. Clendenin had been completely inundated by a flood. I can't remember the exact numbers or details, but there's a little river that runs through next to the town of Clendenin. It's kind of in some mountains. And Clendenin kind of sits at the bottom of the mountains. And this little river typically is just a couple of feet high, and within 24 hours, it rose to, I believe, close to 30 feet and just completely swamped the entire community. I mean, people lost everything, water damage, mold issues, other stuff. Houses had to be torn down. And one lady in particular that we talked to kind of stuck out to me. And it was this lady who, when we saw her, I mean, there's just utter despair. And you would expect that in a situation like that. You'd expect to see someone who is just at a loss for what to do or how to move forward. And so as we talked to this lady, she told us her story that she had actually not too terribly long before this massive flood came through and destroyed her mobile home that she had bought there in the little town of Clendenin. She had actually retired and sold everything that she had, her car, everything. She bought a bike, and her plan was just to live the rest of her life in this little town and to settle. And every bit of what she had left, every bit of it was destroyed. And here she was, and she was in her 60s, I believe, and it was just one of those things. Like, how do you start over? How do you start over? Um, at the age of 65 or 66 or whatever her age was. Um, I mean, just complete despair, complete brokenness. And the reality of it is that we will experience those kinds of things in our lives as well. We will see times of brokenness. We will see times of hurt. We'll see times of despair. We'll begin to question and say, God, what are you doing? Where are you at? Why are we experiencing the things that we're experiencing? And I've talked the last couple of weeks about the fact that it's not by accident that we're in the book of Job. Job speaks a lot to despair and brokenness and hurt and pain. It answers a lot of questions for us as we begin to seek how do we process the difficulties that we experience in this life. And one of the things that I find profound in the book of Job is a lot of times we question the presence of evil, or why are bad things happening? Why do good people suffer? And I think that the root of that question assumes that there is a good God, right? Because if there is a good God, then how can there be suffering? And the reality of it is even in the midst of suffering, God is doing something. He is accomplishing good for His people, and we've seen that as we have seen people who have suffered great loss. One of the coolest things that I've seen over the last week is the way that our community and the way that our churches and the way that people in general have rallied together to care for and to love one another. I mean, it's been so incredible to see how quickly and how creatively people are meeting needs. And so we see good happening as a result of significant loss and heartache. And so I think that there is great hope for us even in the midst of hurt. So far in the book of Job, we have covered the first 5 chapters. Tonight we'll look at chapter 6 and 7. But Job is a man that God Himself, it's recorded in Scripture as him saying that Job was blameless and upright. He was a man of a character and integrity. He was a man that at the beginning of the book of Job had extreme wealth and had a large family, which was a sign of God's blessing. He had many people who worked for him, but then in an instant, all of that was gone. Satan, the accuser, accused Job of only being faithful because God had protected him, and so as a result, God grants Satan the permission to afflict Job, but not to begin with to touch his health, and then later to touch his life. And so in the course of minutes, Job finds out that all of his livestock have either been burned up or raided, that his children, all 10 of them, feasting together, similar to what we would see as a tornado. Wind comes and knocks the house down. All 10 children are killed in that. He then begins to suffer with really intense boils, and we'll talk a little bit about that here in just a few minutes. So his health begins to diminish. His wife just says, "Hey, why don't you just curse God and die?" And so he is left alone with no one to comfort. And then in the midst of all of this, he has 3 friends who travel a great distance to come and to encourage and to comfort. They grieved. They were broken when they saw him. They sat silent with him for 7 days. And then Job speaks. And for the first time, Job begins to lament. He begins to, he says that he wanted to curse the day that he had died. He questioned, why did I not die at birth? Why do I still have life now? And so at the conclusion of that, this is where we picked up last week with Eliphaz, his first friend. who was likely the oldest and came from a place where it was known for its wise men. He begins to speak, and what comes from his mouth is poor doctrine, and it is bad theology, and it is of no help at all to Job. And we learned several things from that last week. Well, here we find there are 3 cycles of speeches throughout the book of Job, and so we're in the first cycle. So Job has spoken. Eliphaz now has responded to Job, and now in chapter 6 and 7, Job is going to respond again, and we're going to see several things tonight that we'll move through fairly quickly. But it kind of serves as an outline for us as we look at Job 6 and 7. The first thing that we're going to see is we're going to see Job's justification. So Eliphaz, again, he has said, listen, this idea of the doctrine of retribution, this is happening to you because you have in some way angered or offended God. The innocent do not suffer, which we know is bad doctrine. Jesus himself, being perfect and innocent, suffered on our behalf. And so Eliphaz is saying, listen, in chapters 4 and 5, you have done something. You have done something. You have erred in some way. You've committed some sin because the innocent prosper. They don't suffer. And so Job in chapter 6, verse 1, down through 7, he actually begins to offer his justification. It's interesting. He doesn't respond directly to Eliphaz. He almost ignores what Eliphaz has said, and he kind of continues on where he left off in chapter 3. And so he says this, Job answered and said, "Oh, that my vexation were weighed, and all my calamity laid in the balances. For then it would be heavier than the sand of the sea. Therefore my words have been rash. For the arrows of the Almighty are in me. My spirit drinks their poison. The terrors of God are arrayed against me. Does the wild donkey bray when he has grass, or the ox low over his fodder? Can that which is tasteless be eaten without salt, or is there any taste in the juice of the mallow? My appetite refuses to touch them. They are as food that is loathsome to me." Now, we know that Job is also poetic, and so there's some language in here, some references that we may not understand at the very beginning, but I want to explain those to you. This is, again, Job trying to justify the way that he is feeling as he is kind of existing in this darkness. And so he begins by saying, "Oh, that my vexation," which is another word for misery or sorrow, "oh, that my vexation were weighed, and my calamity laid in the balances." So it's like this scale, like, oh, if we could take what I am feeling and what I have gone through, and if we could weigh it, then it would be heavier than the sand of the sea. All right, which here is a reference to probably the thing that Job could think of as being the heaviest. The sand of the sea would be heavier. If you were to weigh what I've been through, if you were to weigh my calamity, it would be unbelievably heavy. You think that the heaviest thing that you could imagine in my calamity and my sorrow and everything that I've been through, it would be heavier. So therefore my words have been rash. My words have been justified. I've not acted out. I'm not out of line. It's interesting here too. We have this picture of this weight that is crushing Job, forcing him to speak. It would be as though we were to lay you down and place a boulder on your chest, and it forces the air out of your mouth. This is the picture that we have from Job here. That this weight that he is carrying is forcing him to speak. And in doing so, he is not being irrational. He is justified in the way that he is reacting to this. And he says, "For the arrows of the Almighty are in me." So for the first time, he acknowledges that God is ultimately sovereign over all of this. It says, "For my spirit drinks their poison, the terrors of God are arrayed against me." He realizes that this is happening according to the permissive will of God, though God himself is not causing this to happen. And then he says, is it right? Is it right for me to suffer? He says, listen, does the wild donkey bray when he has grass, or the ox low over his fodder? When it has what is right for him, and he's saying here as a man who is righteous, when there is unrighteousness, should I not lament? So the wild donkey's not going to lament when he has his grass. The ox is not going to low if he has what is right for him. And so he is saying, I am a righteous man. Should I not be bothered by the fact that calamity has come upon me? And then he says that this is really revolting, that he can't stomach it. He said, can that which is tasteless be eaten without salt? Or is there any taste in the juice of the mallow? My appetite refuses to touch them. They are as food that is loathsome to me. It was more than he was willing to stomach. And so I think that in the midst of all of this, we can relate to Job, because we oftentimes, small things, big things, we want to be justified. We want people to know, why are we acting or saying or doing the things that we're doing. And we have to make sure that it's coming from a place of humility. Now keep in mind, Job is unaware of what is going on. He just knows that there's this great affliction and calamity. He's probably very obviously confused and questioning a lot of things. But for us, as we seek to be justified, we have to make sure that it comes from a place of humility, that it comes from a place of sound doctrine and sound theology. So we see Job's justification. The second thing that we see Job's weakness. Starting verse 8, it says, "Oh, that I might have my request, and that God would fulfill my hope." And this is his hope, that it would please God to crush me, that he would let loose his hand and cut me off. This would be my comfort, and I would even exult in pain unsparing, for I have not denied the words of the Holy One. What is my strength that I should wait, and what is my end that I should be patient? Is my strength the strength of stones, or is my flesh bronze? Have I any help in me when resource is driven from me? And so he says, here is my hope. Here's my request, that God would crush me, that he would cut me off. It says, this would be my comfort. Now, this isn't suicidal. This isn't him threatening to end his own life. This is saying, God, spare me, comfort me by allowing me to leave this place of suffering. Says I would even exult in pain and sparing it. Now here it is, and this is why right here. Okay, this is why Job, in his thinking, says, "Crush me, cut me off, for I have not denied the words of the Holy One." Now there are many commentators who would say, and I believe that this to be true, is that Job realized that he was probably pretty quickly approaching his breaking point, and that if he were to be cut off or crushed in that moment, that there would be this confidence that he had not spoken ill against God, that he had not denied the words of the Holy One. And so in that regard, he says, crush me. Crush me before I sin. Crush me before I speak against you. And he says, what is my strength that I should wait? Literally, there's nothing within me. What is my end that I should be patient? Have I any help in me when resource is driven from me? So we see this weakness. I think that in a lot of ways, Job is right. We'll talk about that in a few minutes, that our weakness is legit, that we are completely dependent upon God. Third, we see Job's disappointment. So we see his justification, verses 1 through 7. We see his weakness, verses 8 through 13. Here we see his disappointment. And I think that we are, especially in this these couple of verses, we're going to be able to relate to Job very, very well. We're going to relate to him very, very well in this disappointment. It's kind of broken up into two parts. Here, verses 14 through 21 deals with his disappointment. It says, he who withholds kindness from a friend forsakes the fear of the Almighty. Now he's going to begin to address these friends who have come to encourage him. Eliphaz has already spoken. As Eliphaz kind of rebuked Job and accused him of being in the wrong, his other friends sat silently. It says, he who withholds kindness from a friend forsakes the fear of the Almighty. And then he goes on and he's going to describe what these friends are like to him. My brothers are treacherous as a torrent bed, as torrential streams that pass away. So he's saying, if you guys live around Chickamauga, I know Ringgold has some really bad flooding. We live over kind of by the high school baseball field and softball field and Helicopter Park. And this week, all of the baseball field, all of the softball field, Helicopter Park was the highest that I had ever seen the water since I've lived here. It actually came across the road. There's some houses in the old mill village that actually took on some water. They were surrounded by water. And as quickly as it came, it kind of went. And it was gone by the next day. And so I kind of pictured that. I kind of picture this, the little creek that runs beside Helicopter Park and the baseball field and softball field. And most of the time it's dry, right? But every now and then, here comes this water, and here comes a flood. It's there for a little bit, and then it's gone. And he says that my friends are like this torrent bed, all right, torrential streams that pass away. It says, which are dark with ice, and where the snow hides itself. And when they melt, they disappear. When it's hot, they vanish from their place. And so, essentially, what he's saying is that these friends are like these wadis in the Middle East. That during the winter, when no one needs the water, there's an abundance. But then, in the time of need, when it becomes hot and arid and people want water, those beds are completely dry. And he's saying, you are like these wadis. You are like these stream beds that you're there when you're not needed, but when you're needed the most, you're gone. You're absent. You have disappointed me. You have not been loyal. And so Job is extremely disappointed with these friends. Now, keep in mind, I mean, these friends, to their credit, they came from a long distance to try to encourage and comfort. Their words will fall short. But Job expected a deeper sense of loyalty, and we have to be careful of that. We have to, and we'll see in just a few minutes, we have to not be willing to, we have to be willing to receive words that are not easy to hear. Okay? So as brothers and sisters in Christ, we have to be willing to hear accountability. We have to be willing to hear constructive criticism. We need to be held accountable. Job here is lost in all of this because he's seeking to be comforted, and he is not feeling comforted, right? He's feeling dismayed and disappointed because he's being accused rather than these friends trying to empathize with him. But then he goes on in verse 18, he's talking about the same thing. The caravans turn aside from their course. They go up into the waste and they perish. So this idea of these people who are traveling, the caravans of Tema, they looked, the travelers of Sheba, they hoped. These were places of commerce. These people were traders. They were like trading goods. They were traveling, and they would look off in the distance, and they would see this water, and they would get there. And it says that they are ashamed because they were confident. They come there and are disappointed. So they would travel off of the path and maybe even get lost because they're looking for this water. They see it, but when they get there, the water is gone. Job is saying that you are like these people. All right, you are this great disappointment because I need comfort, and instead you are giving me accusations. It says, for now you have become nothing. You see my calamity and are afraid. Now this is very interesting. This is what he is saying to his friends. He says, because you believe that I am in sin, you are afraid to come close to me. You are afraid to empathize with me. You are afraid to in a sense, walk with me through this because you don't want to find yourself guilty. you don't want to find yourself in a similar situation, so you are going to leave me in my suffering. And then he goes on and he continues, says, have I said, make me a gift, or from your wealth offer a bribe for me, or deliver me from the adversary's hand, or redeem me from the hand of the ruthless? He's saying, I haven't asked you for anything. All right. And now he's becoming more direct. And then in verse 24, we see his accountability. Now, I wish I could say that this was from a genuine spirit of humility and not frustration. But he does say, he says, teach me and I'll be silent. Make me understand how I have gone astray. Search me. Help me understand this. Help me to see where I have gone astray. How forceful are upright words, but what does reproof from you reprove? Basically, what is your counsel to me right now? Do you think that you can reprove words when the speech of a despairing man is wind? And would you even cast lots over the fatherless and bargain over your friend? And so he's accusing them of acting like these unsavory people. But now be pleased to look at me, for I will not lie to your face. Please turn, let no injustice be done. And there are some commentators that believe that this isn't just referring to listen, seek to understand where I'm coming from, but that they may actually have physically turned away from Job. Please turn, let no injustice be done. Turn now, my vindication is at stake. Is there any injustice on my tongue? Cannot my palate discern the cause of calamity? Listen, he's saying, listen, I should be able to know whether or not I'm in the right or the wrong here. Like, I know my heart. But hold me accountable. And I think there's some wisdom there where as we're seeking counsel from other people, we invite other people into our lives to say, hey, look at my life and show me and teach me where I am in error. All right, hold me accountable. So we see his justification, we see his weakness, we see his disappointment, we see his accountability. And then chapter 7, we're going to see his misery. Verses 1 through 5, we see the misery of his existence. He is now going to turn away from his friends and to speak directly to God. Has not man a hard service on earth, and are not his days like the days of a hired hand? Basically, is life not hard labor? Like a slave who longs for the shadow, like a hired hand who looks for his wages. So I am allotted months of emptiness, and nights of misery are appointed to me. All right, basically, he's saying that there's no meaning. Right? There's no meaning to my suffering. We're like these slaves who long for the shadow, a hired hand who looks for his wages. But yeah, there's months of emptiness. There's nothing in return. When I lie down, I say, when shall I rise? But the night is long, and I am full of tossing till the dawn. My flesh is clothed with worms and dirt. My skin hardens and then breaks out afresh. So he's talking about this despair of this suffering is meaningless. But then he talks a little bit more about his physical suffering. He says, my flesh is clothed with worms and dirt. My skin hardens. Even if you've ever had a really bad cut or rash, kind of scabs over, provides even a little bit of hope and relief because it means that it's healing. But man, if that scab is ripped open again, it kind of reopens that wound. And that's what he's describing. My skin hardens, right? These boils are scabbed over, but then it breaks out afresh. It continues to happen. He says, my days are swifter than a weaver's shuttle and come to their end without hope. And so he talks about this like a weaver and a loom and how quickly it passes back and forth until it's out of thread. It comes quickly. He's saying, my days are short. Right? Brevity of life. Our life is but a mist, as Scripture says. And he thinks even now that the end of his life is coming. And so we see his misery. There's this hopelessness of all of this is meaningless. There's this suffering. There's this darkness and despair. And life is short anyway. And my life is probably near its end. And then in verses 7 through 21, which is where we'll close, we see Job's plea. It says, remember that my life is a breath. And this idea of remember is to call attention to. Almost as if Job is saying, hey, God, pay attention to me. Remember me. You've turned and you're focused on something else. Look at me. Remember me. My life is a breath. Again, this brevity of existence. And then we see the darkness and the despair again. My eye will never again see good. The eye of him who sees me will behold me no more. While your eyes are on me, I shall be gone, as the cloud fades and vanishes. So he who goes down to Sheol does not come up. He returns no more to his house, nor does his place know him anymore. It says, therefore, I will not restrain my mouth. I will speak in the anguish of my spirit. I will complain in the bitterness of my soul. Am I the sea or a sea monster that you set a guard over me? Basically, am I this enemy that you must keep this close watch over me? And this is very ironic, and we'll talk about this in just a minute. It says, when I say my bed will comfort me, my couch will ease my complaint, then you scare me with dreams and terrify me with visions so that I would choose strangling and death rather than my bones. So I'm seeking comfort and sleep in the bed or the couch, and yet you terrify me with these nightmares. So I would rather choose death. It says, I loathe my life. I would not live forever. Leave me alone. What? I mean, I'm almost at a loss, okay? As I read these words, leave me alone. Job, this man who is blameless and upright, speaking to the only source of comfort, the only source of hope, the only source of healing and restoration and peace. And he says, leave me alone. I think that there are times maybe in our own lives where we, if we're honest, we get to a point where we have this attitude of, God, just leave me alone. Just leave me alone. Let me go on about my way. And it takes a real, a real heavy weight to get to a dark place like that. But I know that we have found ourselves there at different points in our lives. But Job says, leave me alone. His plea is not for restoration, for God to draw near. It is, God, go. Leave me alone. What is man that you make so much of him and that you set your heart on him? Now, later in Scripture, we see this idea of, what is man that you're mindful of me, that the God of creation has created humanity as the jewel of his creation, and that you know me and you care for me and you know the number of hairs on my head, and you if I know that if you're going to feed the birds of the air, that you're going to care for me, if you're going to dress the fields with beautiful flowers and you're going to care for me. But here he sees it as a curse in his darkness. That you set your heart on him, visit him every morning, and test him every moment. I pray that God would be mindful of me and that I would be set on his heart, and that he would visit every morning and that he would test me every moment. I long for the presence of God, and here Job sees it as a curse. How long will you not look away from me, nor leave me alone till I swallow my spit? He says, listen, just look away from me. Please stop paying attention to me. Leave me alone. Now, the beautiful thing is God promises never to leave us or forsake us. If I sin, what do I do to you, you watcher of mankind? Have you made me your mark? Or why have you made me your mark? Why have I become a burden to you? Why do you not pardon my transgression and take away my iniquity? He's saying, if I have sinned, why will you not just forgive me? Now, we know that's not the issue. We know the issue is not that Job has sinned. We know that ultimately what God is going to do from this is because Job is faithful and he is sustained by God himself, that God is going to bless and God is going to restore. It says, for now I shall lie in the earth. You will seek me but I shall not be. Now, a couple of things as we close, just some ideas that I think that we need to consider tonight. First, I want to talk a few minutes about what Job gets right. Okay, Job is right when he says that our burdens can be heavy. When he feels the weight of burdens, our burdens can be very heavy. And you may be watching this, and you may be impacted by the storm. You may be impacted by sickness, other things that are going on, hurt, and those burdens can be unbelievably heavy. Our weakness is real. He talks about his weakness. We are utterly dependent upon God to move and to act. And we trust God in his sovereign will to bring about all things for our good, Romans 8:28. But our weakness is real. We think that oftentimes we can just push through, that we are self-sufficient or self-reliant, and that is a recipe for disaster and brokenness because ultimately we're weak. Now, the beautiful part of that is that, as Paul says, in my weakness, he is made strong, because it's when I realize that I am utterly dependent upon God that I begin to see his provision and I see his protection. I see his goodness in my life when I realize that I am utterly dependent upon him because I am weak. Another thing that he's right on is that our friends cannot satisfy our needs. If we're looking for friendship or family or someone else to fully and completely satisfy or fully and completely comfort us, we will be let down. Why? Because we are broken people trying to love broken people. And so we will not love perfectly. We will not counsel perfectly. We will not comfort perfectly. But there is a God who exists who will. He will love us perfectly. He will counsel us perfectly. He will comfort us perfectly. He's also right when he says that our lives are short. Man, if the last month or so has not reminded us that this life is like a mist. Here today, gone tomorrow. Which is why it is absolutely imperative that we come to a place where we realize that our only hope beyond this life is in Jesus Christ. That Jesus came and he lived among his creation perfectly. He willingly went to the cross to suffer for our sin and shame, for the very worst that we have done. Jesus suffered on our behalf. He suffered our sin and our shame. And on the cross, God poured out his judgment upon Jesus so that through faith we would be set free. Our life is short. There's a couple things that Job gets wrong, and this is where we'll end. First, our suffering is not meaningless. We'll probably talk about this every week in the story of in the study of Job, is that our suffering is not meaningless. The things that we experience are not meaningless. That God will do that, or he will do something with that. As I drove down Woodland Drive yesterday in Ottawa, and I saw the just utter destruction for those families, I have significant hope because I know that from the ashes, God brings something beautiful. Our suffering is not meaningless. You say, well, I can't find the meaning. Well, it may be something that we never are able to see in this life. But I fully believe that those who suffer well and those who are faithful in the midst of suffering, that God will reward for all of eternity. And the second, that our comfort comes, the second thing that Job gets wrong is that our comfort comes through God's absence. That our comfort comes through God's absence. Job is saying, leave me alone. But here's the reality. The reality of it is our comfort comes because we know that God is present. Jesus, again on the cross, he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? What an absolutely profound statement. Because when Christ was suffering on the cross, God the Father pours out his judgment and he turns away from the Son. And yet we are promised that he will never leave or forsake us. Jesus was forsaken so that we would not be. When we're in the midst of darkness, God is walking with us through the storm. And that's where we find our great hope. My encouragement is seek after God with all that you are, even in hard times. Know that God is our hope, that his presence is our hope. Do not become bitter. Do not become angry. I understand that there may be a lot of questions, and I'd love to talk with you. If you have questions, shoot me a message, and I'd be glad to just talk through whatever you're going through and just seek to encourage you. No agenda, just to be available, to try to be a better comfort than Job's friends were to Job. And so if that's what you need, send me a message. I'll be glad to talk to you. Next week we'll work through some more of this first speech cycle in the book of Job. But do this for me. This week, find ways to serve people around you. Find ways to comfort people, to speak truth in a way that is loving and kind, to empathize with people to the best of your ability, and to use a time where people are hurting and broken and show them where our hope is. Love you guys, praying for you. Hopefully I'll see you guys soon.